So we're going to begin by looking at some of the cultural implications for assessment based on what you heard yesterday. And in thinking about what was presented yesterday in terms of culture and trauma and their relevance to assessment, I think we begin to see four basic principles emerge. The first being to remember that treatment of the client actually begins with the first meeting. And so even though you may be thinking about, okay, I'm doing an assessment, you are, so any time that you spend with the client from the client's point of view, this is all about treatment and intervention and assistance and help. You're working to establish the therapeutic alliance. You're engaging the client in what we're going to later identify as one of the overarching goals of trauma treatment, which has to do with establishing a sense of safety. And so in this process, you're going to actually, in this assessment process, you're actually going to be venturing further into a healing journey than you may be consciously aware of when you think, oh, the first thing I need to do is get a good assessment of this situation. The second principle is that as you begin even that first session, you want to be very aware that you don't re-trigger or create additional trauma for the client during any phase of your interaction with them. And I think it's, as clinicians, it's one of our primary responsibilities to monitor how the client is responding to any verbal exchange we have with them. And of course, none of us are perfect. And so this means that we pay close attention verbally to what we're saying, close attention to our nonverbal reactions, the client's nonverbal reaction, and that we may have to be the first one to raise the question of, did something I say upset you? And in a way, by doing this, we are saying to the clients that we're in this journey together, and you'll be demonstrating that they have the permission and the power to raise concerns, which for many survivors, they have neither been granted the power to speak, and even if they have been led to believe they can express themselves, when they actually begin, they often find out that there's no tolerance for what they're trying to say. And even at this stage, this early stage, this might be a good time to establish with the client that they can even do a hand gesture, raising their hand, raising a finger, or shaking their head, some developing some kind of cue that both of you understand will be interpreted as, oh, wait a minute, we need to pause and look at what's happening. I think also during the assessment phase, that is the time to begin communicating to the client that the work that you're doing together has a strengths base, because clients often come in feeling very damaged, very defective, and we want to be transmitting the message. And I'm using the word transmitting because I don't think it's just about verbally saying, well, you can interrupt me at any moment. We want to give them an experience of interrupting and feeling good about that experience. We want to let the client know that we're interested in knowing them as a whole person. So we are not starting out this assessment asking about what happened to them, but maybe asking them to tell us a little bit about the circumstances that they're living in now, or to tell us a little bit about how they came to find out about us, and using what they tell us to reinforce the idea that, oh, it's your strengths that have gotten you to this point. We want to also give the clients a sense that what may have been labeled as symptoms has been actually part of their survival strategy, part of that resilience that's allowed them to survive. Things like numbness, things like not meeting eye contact, freeze responses, that we want to reframe these as part of strength and survival strategies rather than signs of a disorder. We can ask questions like, what helped you to stay so determined to survive? How did you find the courage to come here today? I also would suggest that when you are asking information gathering questions, because survivors' memories may be fragmented and they are not going to remember perhaps even some basic information about themselves all in a logical sequence. And so when asking the questions, so if it's framed in terms of as far as you can remember right now, suggesting that, well, they may remember some additional pieces of information in the future. And then the last principle, I think it's very important to let the clients know they always have the power of choice throughout the time with you. They have choice in terms of what questions they want to answer. They have choice in terms of how much to speak about. They have choices about what information they choose to reveal. They have choices about remaining silent, or if they want to change the subject and talk about something else. And that doesn't mean you ignore the fact that they've made a choice. You may call attention to that choice and ask for help in understanding it. but it's in this early interaction that you're actually giving them that experience of making choice. And perhaps that's going to elicit a freeze response. So then you can start by exploring, well, what's going on right here and now in the moment. Some of the remaining points on this slide are going to be reviewed individually and discussed in the subsequent slide. So I'm going to move on to the next one now. And I apologize, there may be some difficulties with the PowerPoint display, but your packets have an accurate depiction of each of the points on the slide. So this next slide outlines some of the culturally based trauma factors to consider when you're forming your questions and thinking with the client about some of the information we try to elicit in the early sessions. And the point of drawing attention to these factors is just a way to remind us of some of the cultural determinants that are in the background. And that's why we started the presentation reviewing some of those factors. So against the backdrop of what is considered well in a culture, and so you might begin by exploring, does wellness have any meaning to the person sitting with you in the room, and what is that wellness about? We also want to know what kinds of signals of distress are allowed in the cultural context that they've been raised in. Because while we may easily welcome certain kinds of descriptions and be familiar with certain kinds of descriptions using Western terminology, other cultures often use a totally different perspective and different language. And so, I think one of the things that's important to any therapeutic process is that the clinician and the client develop a language together to talk about the client's experiences. We may understand things in terms of clinical terminology, but we have to have a way of talking with clients that they can relate to. And so when there are cultural differences, that becomes even more important. So I'm going to give some examples because we understand literal definitions of words, they might be used in a culture to describe mental phenomena differently. So, for example, some cultures will talk about scars on the heart mind as a way of identifying memory problems. Some cultures may talk about soul attachment problems when they are talking about fear. Some cultures will see madness as anger that has gone out of control. Anxiety can get talked about in terms of lack of energy, drying out of the body. Depression may be talked about in terms of the physical experience of numbness and tingling and upset stomach. So, in some ways, some of our Western terminology is more abstract and conceptual when we're talking about symptoms and diagnosis. But you might find in talking with clients that it's useful to present them with an outline of the body on a piece of paper and ask them to locate and name where the various organ systems are, because even in terms of how organ systems are identified, in the West, we look at the heart, we look at the different organs as separate entities. In other cultures, there are connecting systems of energy that exist, linking various organs together, such as such as the gallbladder and the small intestine. And you also want to when the clients begin to show you the locations of the various systems, before you jump in and say, oh no, this is here and that's there, you want to explore how did they come to this understanding. And then you can also use color coding to talk about the intensity of physical symptoms. You can use color coding for identifying and labeling emotions and where they're located in the body. You can look at what symptoms a person believes are located in their head, in their heart, in the body as a whole. So there are a number of different ways, and I'm going to add even more to this use of the body diagram as we go along. Another factor that's important with symptom presentation is what kinds of signs does the culture see as identifying people being at risk? Because some cultures may talk about risk in terms of people with weak souls, people who are of a lower caste system. In some cultures, children are vulnerable because their souls are not yet fully expressing themselves in the body. I think it's also important because we're usually trying to do some kind of developmental assessment to find out what norms the culture assigns to each stage of development, because those may vary from the ones we've identified in Western culture, and to ask some questions about in their developmental schema, where the correlations lie between certain signs of distress and where a child might be developmentally. And finally, I think it's important to try to find out what behaviors are rewarded during the course of a child's development, and what behaviors are limited. And, again, we can look back at some of what we talked about yesterday in terms of does the culture allow for eye contact, and under what circumstances? And children are going to be absorbing some of these norms very early on, which is, and so they become an ingrained pattern by the time we're seeing the client. And some clients may have deviated from these culturally accepted patterns, but I think we have to be careful to make our own assessment of who was labeling what and who's labeling things now and what the client is labeling. Go on to the next slide, which draws attention to monitoring arousal during the course of the assessment. And you're going to hear that we're going to return to monitoring arousal many times during the course of the assessment phase, as well as during the treatment phase, because what is going on in the client's body physiologically, their arousal level, is going to have a large influence on how much they're going to be able to benefit from the intervention, the extent to which they can form an alliance with you. And it's not so much that their arousal level has to be perfectly in balance all the time. And you always have to be the facilitator of that perfect balance. But it is important for you and the client to develop a way that they can begin to notice what's going on in their body, and be able to develop some internal dialogue with themselves about it, as well as with you, in order to lay the foundation to intervene with that. And we can't delay dealing with arousal until we formally begin treatment, because for the client, just being with a strange person can be very triggering, because they may have been shuffled from person to person, lots of strange faces bombarding them all of the time. And for the moment that they're just sitting with you in the room for the first time, that may be something that is very high on their list of triggers, but you don't know that going in. And so, again, rather than trying to focus on gathering all kinds of information on things that may have happened or on the past, a lot of times I think it's more important to start gathering information about what it's like right there in those moments in the room. And so you're going to begin to, right from the start, begin to help the client to make a connection between what is going on in the environment around them and what they are sensing in their body. And we're going to talk more about how to facilitate that when we talk about treatment. But if someone in the long term is going to have any sense of self-determination, self-regulation, being able to experience yourself taking care of that arousal level goes a long way. Also, as we're going to return to tomorrow, there is a lot, or I'm sorry, later in the presentation, sometimes I slip back into what was the original plan for this workshop. I'm sorry. But anyhow, we're going to talk more about the effect of hyperarousal on the brain and the autonomic nervous system, and its effect on forming new circuitry. So, and I think also starting with paying close attention to signs of hyperarousal or hyper being elevated, hypo meaning lowered arousal. When it's happening right there in the room and you can find a way to talk about it in language that both of you understand, then there is a gateway to begin to talk about what is concerning the client about themselves, and eventually perhaps the history involving the trauma. I think, again, this is a time when you can use that body outline to identify where the sensations are located, to jot down with the client words that signify to them what the sensation is about. I'm going to go on to the next slide now. I think absolutely crucial in the early parts of the assessment is taking a look at what are the areas of strength, both internally and externally, that the client relies on and can make use of. And once again, by looking for where some of the areas of strength lie, we're reinforcing the client's awareness that of their own resilience. I think I mentioned earlier when you raised the question of how the client managed to get to you. You want to pay attention to what appears to be intact areas of cognitive functioning, memory, verbal ability, how do they seem to relate to their body in the space in the room. You want to look at, do they display any kinds of creativity? You want to look at, is the way are there aspects of the way they relate to you that would appear to be strength in establishing connection. You may be able to talk a little bit about their attachment history. But again, I would start with talking and looking at how is the client engaging with you. And whether you know, do you see evidence that the client has some self-soothing abilities? And maybe you can ask a little bit about how did they come to have these skills, and um, you can ask a little bit if they're not a parent in the room. You can ask clients directly about what helps to make them comfortable or feeling peaceful. Again, this is one of those places where you might want to check out what the words mean. If you talk about peaceful or calmer, what any of those words mean to the client, or if they have their own words that they can relate to, because these words evoke body sensations, and it's at the level of sensation where I think the healing shifts begin. You want to find out what role their spiritual beliefs are playing now, maybe what role they've played in the past, because that can shift greatly as a result of somebody's experiences. You want to find out, are there family members or friends that the client experiences positively? You want to find out, is there a family history of trauma? And how did others in the family survive? You also want to find out what sources of assistance are available in the community that the client comes from, and how do people make use of those resources, so that, again, you're beginning to look for strengths that can be anchoring for the client as you move through the intervention process. Even as we think about the concept of healing, we want to look at what is the client's definition of healing, or recovery, and I say that in quotes. I mean, I like to think about growing, that we are all in a process of growing, and we access that growth in a number of different ways. So you want to get a sense of, well, what do they believe needs attention? And even though you may see a lot of things that need attention, it's I think really important to start with something that the client can relate to, and realize that you don't want to be paralleling the client's sense of being overwhelmed. That when you can identify a focus with the client, that immediately begins to communicate the message of, okay, we're going to take this step by step. It's not so much in the words that you're using, like, oh, we're going to do this step by step, but the fact that you actually do it in the room with the client. You want to have some idea about how the family regards seeking outside help, how the culture regards seeking outside help, and who the legitimate helpers are. Are they shamans? Are they imams? Are they Chinese medicine doctors? Are they clergy of some kind? Are they medicine men? And you also want to get a sense of what defines mental health, and what makes somebody qualified to provide mental health intervention, which might be called something else like heart mind healing. So all of this time spent in the assessment and gathering information is also a way of forming a language that you and the client can understand together, and using that as a foundation to keep adding to that as you go along. Before we go on to talking about different kinds of interventions, I think we have to think a little bit about goal setting. You know, we talk about goals. We talk all the time about how goal setting with the client is part of the intervention as a whole, and how important it is for those goals to be client self-determined. And so and at the same time, as clinicians, we have, I think we operate with certain professional goals or frames of reference that we're bringing into the intervention. And when it comes to trauma, I've always felt that Judith Herman's model lays out some overarching goals that are useful for us to keep in mind as we talk about more specific goals related to each one of these, but I think these form the general perspective. The establishment of safety, the reintegration of memories, the restoring connection to life. And the question becomes for each client, what does establishing safety and self-ownership mean? We know conceptually what those things mean. The client, the word safe may not be, it may be something in the client's cognitive awareness, but as far as an experiential understanding of safety, they may have no sense of that. And we're going to bring the language that we've begun to accumulate, that shared language, into play when we're talking about the goals. Another thing to keep in mind just about this sequence of goals is that they do follow a logical order, but as we're working in treatment, we may be starting with, if the client comes in and may present a memory right from the outset. And so we're going to be working at the same time, rather than, for example, to take that memory and, it can be tempting to ask for more and more information at that point. But I often found myself slowing the client down and saying, well, wait, let's just take let's pause with this one element of experience, and talk about what it is feeling like right here and now, first of all, to be talking about it, then maybe talking about how did they move on from that experience to get where they are here and now, before I would dig into an elaboration of all the details surrounding that experience. And that part of that would be my commitment to establishing safety and self-ownership as perhaps the highest priority in the moment. So the next 3 slides are going to look at these 3 overarching goals. So the material, as you can see on this slide, was largely drawn from some of Bessel van der Kolk's work, which I think in the book, The Body Keeps the Score, just really fully elaborates on a biopsychosocial way of working with trauma. But I think what you're seeing on this slide is that each of the criteria points to working toward reestablishing a sense of internal connection and cohesiveness, and for the client to be able to learn how to support that cohesiveness in the environment that they're living in, so that it's no longer threatening. And I think the process of establishing rapport with the client in the room and their experience of moving that rapport into actual, at least limited beginnings of trust, is a huge step in the context of safety. Trust is a long-term goal with clients who've been traumatized. Oftentimes, you can begin to develop a sense of rapport with the client, but for them to be able to internalize the healing experience on a bodily level, that's going to take some repeated experiences with you that they can interpret as safe. And one thing I didn't mention was it's important not to overlook the client's state of physical health and talk about any indications they have that they're in need of medical care. And again, finding out, well, what kind of medical care would be acceptable to them. We certainly know that where somebody has been trafficked, there's likely to have been physical abuse, sexual abuse, and the physical fallout from those experiences. The client needs some way of addressing those if they're going to feel safe in their own bodies. It may not be something you can do immediately, but more something that you would want to talk with the client about and get a sense of how open they are, what their window of tolerance is. And it might take some work to prepare them to get the medical care that they need. The reintegration aspect, and again, these aren't always going to be coming in the order I'm presenting them, has to do with lessening some of the internal constriction, inhibition, overwhelming thoughts, images, emotion, freeze responses, the sensations, as well as restoring a sense of possibility for the future. And I think one of the key ingredients that we have to keep in mind during any reintegration process is just how significant the component of loss is to people. And they may not be labeling it as such, but it's something we need to go into with an awareness of looking for. But loss in terms of that sense of cohesive self, loss of trust in oneself and other people, loss of faith, loss of hope, loss of a sense of autonomy, losses in terms of physical functioning, cognitive functioning, emotional functioning, loss of a sense of belonging. And we want to gather some information along the way about how does the culture recognize loss and what are the ways that they deal with it. Another aspect of reintegration has to do with forgiveness, and which I think is often just as much about self-forgiveness, perhaps more importantly about self-forgiveness. So finding out what the client feels guilty about, what the client is ashamed about, what the client thought they should do differently, should have done differently. And when it comes to the people who have inflicted the exploitation or the abuse on the survivor, the forgiveness process is really not about, it's not being done for the benefit of the person who perpetuated the injury. but finding a way more for the client to move forward and live in a way that their lives are less constricted as a result of the trauma that they experience. Many of the people who are trafficked, there isn't really going to be any possibility of confronting their abusers. That doesn't mean you can't talk about what they would like to say when they're ready, what they would like to say, what they would want the person who committed the exploitation to understand about the impact of what they've done. But that might be more something that is done through imagery than, and that can be another loss. So working with some of the concepts of forgiveness, and that forgiveness, because as we talked about in the family, in some cultures, when children are trafficked, their parents may make the decision to have them trafficked, either because they can't support the children or they think that there is something wrong with the child, and they don't know how to take care of the child, so they give the child up. And so we're not necessarily just talking about all the injurious experiences coming at the hands of strangers. And that's another component of thinking about, okay, what are the goals? What goals do the client and I have around forgiveness and loss? So the last area of trauma treatment goals that Judith Herman identified was about restoring connection. And I looked at some material by Mary Harvey, and there are references to all of the people that I've been citing in your packets. So the last slide summarizes different factors, goal factors in relation to the connection between the client and their surrounding environment. And the slide identifies the first 8 criteria actually are Mary Harvey's. The 9th we added because we felt that seeing hope and possibility for the future, it is critical to maintaining the energy to keep a healing process going. Also, for some clients, depending on their beliefs, which we talked about earlier, you want to find out about those spiritual beliefs, because some of the clients that you're seeing, they may believe in reincarnation and may believe that what is happening in their current connection to the world around them also has relationship to the past and future in terms of reincarnation. A couple of these I want to specifically point out that in a more culturally based understanding, for some clients, for example, the ability to bear emotions might be thought of or spoken of as more of a balance in the heart mind and what needs to happen in the heart and what needs to happen in the mind for that balance to be reset. And the seventh one about a coherent narrative to what they've experienced. You want to be paying attention to, does the client have beliefs in karma? What are their beliefs about suffering? What is the terminology and their methodology for compassion? What determines growth? So I think we can look at these goals and begin to forecast what treatment might look at. But one of the things I think it's important to keep in mind with trauma survivors is that building strengths and providing an experience of healing doesn't happen just in one period of time. And oftentimes, you may not have the opportunity to see a client from the initial coming forward after the traumatic experience to where they ultimately have the potential to get to. And so I think it's most important that it's in other words, it's not so important that we accomplish all the goals as much as in thinking about like a module of treatment where the client comes away from it believing that intervention can be helpful, so that even developmentally across, the life cycle, the meaning of one's experience changes. I spent a lot of time working in child sexual abuse, and I know that for, kids who were abused as children, when they reach adolescence, that has a different meaning. When they go on to have their own children, it has another meaning. And so you have access at different stages of the life cycle to aspects of the trauma that you wouldn't have had at an earlier stage. So I think it is extremely important to have the client experience whatever amount of intervention you can do as a helpful experience, so that they're encouraged to return again. So I'm going to pause before going on to the next set of slides for a moment, just to give you a chance to look over the material that we've presented so far, maybe make some notes of things you'd like to find out more about. And then I'm going to resume and begin to turn our attention to culturally sensitive treatment strategies.